What folks whispered. Let me tell you about a man named Holt Garrison. February of 1884. The rolling hills of eastern Oregon lay frozen under a sky the color of old iron. Snow dusted the ridgelines and gathered in the coulees where the wind couldn't reach. And the creek that ran along Holt's south fence line hadn't made a sound since Christmas. Cold country, quiet country, the kind of place where a man could go a full week without hearing another human voice. If that's what he wanted. And Holt Garrison, by all accounts, wanted exactly that. Now, folks across 3 counties knew his name, hard not to. He ran 1,200 head of cattle on land that stretched from Baker Valley clear to the Blue Mountain foothills. His fences ran straight. His stock stayed fat through the worst winters. And his ranch hands were paid better than any outfit in the territory. People respected Holt Garrison. They tipped their hats when he rode through town and stepped aside on the boardwalk. But they whispered too. Cold as January creek water, they said. Rich as Croesus and twice as lonely. The kind of man who'd lend you $50 but wouldn't stay for supper. Generous with his wallet, stingy with his company. A man who'd built himself a kingdom and then locked himself inside it. They weren't wrong. Exactly. But they weren't right either. See? The thing about Holt was this. He'd learned something hard about people and money, and he'd learned it 3 times over. Which is 2 more than any man should need. A business partner in '76 who shook his hand on Monday and vanished with $2,000 by Friday. A woman in Portland who touched his face like she meant it. Then asked about the ranch acreage before the candle went cold. And a cousin who showed up with his hat in his hands and left with the deed to 40 acres tucked in his coat. The ink still wet on a contract Holt should have read twice. 3 times he'd trusted. 3 times he'd watched someone reach right past him for what he owned. So he stopped giving them the chance. His ranch house was the biggest in the valley. 12 rooms, a stone fireplace grand enough to roast an elk whole, and a dining table built from Oregon oak that could seat 10. But on this particular February evening, 1 chair was pulled from the table, 1 plate set at the head, 1 lamp turned low. The great stone hearth sat cold and dark, though the temperature outside had dropped well past freezing. Holt preferred a wool coat indoors to the trouble of building a fire nobody would share. He ate his supper alone, beef and bread, same as yesterday, same as every day before that, going back further than he cared to count. He washed his plate himself, dried it, and put it back in the same spot. Then he sat on the porch in the bitter dark, watching his breath vanish into nothing, listening to the silence he'd built around himself like a second fence. Next morning, he rode to town and pinned a notice on the board outside Harlan's General Store. Small paper, plain handwriting. Cook wanted. Fair wages. Inquire at Garrison Ranch. He pinned it low on the board, near the bottom corner, almost like he hoped nobody would see it. The widow and the girl. The wagon came up the ranch road on a Tuesday afternoon, pulled by a dun mare that had seen better years and knew it. Holt watched from the barn door as a woman climbed down. Mid-30s, dark hair pinned tight beneath a wool bonnet. Her coat had been patched at the elbows more than once, but patched well, with small even stitches that spoke of care rather than poverty. She moved with the kind of purpose that said she wasn't here to ask for anything she didn't plan to earn. Then a girl slid from the bench seat, 12 years old, maybe, thin-boned and still. She didn't reach for the wagon or fumble for the step. She set her feet on the frozen ground, tilted her head to one side, and listened. The wind carried the sound of cattle lowing in the far pasture. A gate hinge creaking, the soft blow of a horse in the barn. The girl smiled like she'd been handed something pleasant. The woman's voice carried clean across the yard. "Mr. Garrison, I'm Josephine Hadley. I'm here about the cook position." Holt crossed the yard, pulling off his work gloves. You got experience. 15 years worth. I cooked for a boarding house in Pendleton, rode 2 cattle drives with my late husband doing the chuck wagon, and I've cooked every day since for my daughter and me. She said it plain. No boasting, no begging. I work clean. I work steady, and I expect fair pay for honest labor. Holt looked at the girl. She stood perfectly still beside the wagon wheel, her face tilted slightly upward, that small smile still resting easy on her lips. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't casting about for help. She stood like someone who'd already made peace with the ground beneath her feet. This is my daughter, Bess, Josephine said. She's been blind since birth. Mr. Garrison, I'll ask you straight. If that's a problem, say so now and we'll be on our way. I don't care to waste your time or mine. He studied the girl a moment longer. She turned her face toward him as if she could feel the weight of his gaze. Something in her expression wasn't waiting for pity. It was waiting for a decision. Kitchen quarters are around back, Holt said. Stove works. Pump is right outside the door. I'll pay $12 a month plus room and board for both of you. Suits you? That suits me fine. He showed them the quarters. 2 small rooms off the kitchen, clean but bare, with an iron bed in each and a window that faced the East Hills. Josephine surveyed the space with a practical eye and gave a single nod. Bess walked the room slowly, her fingertips trailing the walls, her feet counting the steps between doorway and bed. Bed and stove, stove and pump handle. By the time Holt left them, she knew that kitchen better than most sighted folks would after a month. That evening, the smell of cornbread and bacon drifted through the house for the first time in longer than Holt cared to remember. Beans with molasses bubbling on the stove. From the kitchen, Josephine hummed something low and steady, more breath than melody. A hymn that floated through the hallway like warmth from a room he wasn't allowed to enter. Holt ate in his study with the door closed, but he'd stood in the hallway a moment before closing it. Just a moment. Just long enough. In the kitchen quarters, Bess settled under her quilt and whispered to her mother in the dark. Mama, this house is real quiet, but not empty quiet. More like holding its breath quiet. A man's reasons. By week's end, Holt had reminded himself 3 times why distance was the only policy worth keeping. On Wednesday, he rode to the bank. Harold Finch pumped his hand like they were schoolmates and laughed twice at things that weren't close to funny. He mentioned his office door was always open to a man of Mr. Garrison's considerable standing. And would Holt care to discuss investment opportunities over dinner? Holt would not. On Thursday, Margaret Crane appeared at the ranch gate with her daughter Adelaide in tow. Adelaide was 19, scrubbed pink, and carrying a pie in both hands like it was a holy offering. Margaret did the talking. Holt thanked them for the pie, declined the visit, and watched their wagon retreat down the road with the tired patience of a man who'd seen this particular play performed too many times to count. This was the way of it. Everything a transaction, every smile weighted with calculation, every kindness aimed at something behind him rather than at him. But here's what nobody in town ever saw. Before dawn each morning, while the dark still held and his ranch hands slept, Holt carried split oak to the bunkhouse porch and stacked it neat beside the door. His hands did the work the same way a body breathes. No thought, no announcement. He never mentioned it. Nobody ever thanked him for it. That was the arrangement, and it suited him. In the barn, when the world was silent and cold and his, he talked to his horses. He stood at his mare's stall, resting a hand on her neck, and spoke low enough that the words barely left the space between them. Easy now, Clara girl. Frost is heavy this morning, but that south pasture'll warm up by noon. You and me'll ride the fence line after I get the feelin' back in my fingers. The mare leaned into his hand, and Holt's voice carried something in that barn that it never carried anywhere else. Not softness exactly, more like honesty. And every evening, when Josephine sang while washing the supper dishes, Holt's boots slowed as he passed the kitchen door. He didn't stop, didn't linger where she'd see, but his stride broke. Just half a step, just long enough for the hymn to catch him, hold him, and let him go again. He noticed himself doing it. He tightened his jaw each time and walked on. But the song followed him down the hall, and the bread smell was in every room now, and the house that had held its breath for years was starting to inhale whether he wanted it to or not. What Bess heard now, Bess Hadley was doing something nobody had ever thought to do with Holt Garrison. She was listening to who he was instead of looking at what he had. It started small, the way important things often do. She sat on the kitchen steps each morning while Josephine cooked, her face tilted toward the barn, catching sounds that sighted folks walked past without a second thought. The low murmur of Holt's voice with his horses drifted across the yard. She couldn't make out words at that distance, but she could hear the tone of it. Patient, unhurried, the sound of a man who hadn't lost his gentleness. Just misplaced who to give it to. She learned his boots. This was Bess's particular gift. Reading people by the rhythm of their walk the way others read a face. Holt's stride was different depending on where he was headed. Purposeful and quick toward the barn, slow and heavy toward the house, and something else entirely when he passed the kitchen in the evenings. That stride had a catch in it, a half-step of hesitation, like a man slowing down near a warm stove on a bitter night, wanting to stop, not quite allowing himself to. On the third morning, Bess was sitting on the side porch, wrapped in her shawl against the February cold, when she heard footsteps. No voice, no clearing of a throat, just the careful creak of the porch board and the soft thud of something set down beside her. She reached out and touched wool. Thick, clean, smelling of cedar, a blanket from a chest that hadn't been opened in a while. "Thank you, Mr. Garrison," she said quietly. The boots went still. A beat of silence. Then they retreated across the porch and down the steps, quicker than they'd come. He hadn't said a single word. Hadn't needed to. But Bess knew those footsteps the way most folks knew a familiar face. And she smiled to herself as she pulled the blanket around her shoulders. That was the third quiet kindness she'd counted. The firewood he stacked in the dark before anyone woke. The porch lamp he kept burning on the side nearest the kitchen quarters. Though he never used that door himself, and now a cedar blanket delivered without a word to a girl he barely knew. Remember that. Bess was counting. She cataloged each one not out of strategy but out of recognition. She knew what hidden kindness sounded like. She'd spent her whole life listening for what people meant underneath what they said. And Holt Garrison was the loudest quiet man she'd ever encountered. That evening, Bess told her mother, "Mr. Garrison's got two voices, Mama. The one folks here in town and the one his horses here in the barn." She paused. "The horse one is the real one." Josephine smoothed her daughter's hair. "Don't go making a project of that man, Bess. I ain't making a project. I'm just listening. Somebody ought to." The hills he never described. Bess started appearing in Holt's orbit the way weather does. Not demanding, not avoidable, just there. She perched on the corral fence while he worked cattle, her feet hooked through the rails, her face turned toward the sounds of hooves and rope and Holt's low commands. She sat on the hay bales inside the barn while he brushed down Clara, asking questions between the long strokes of the curry comb. She settled at the far end of the main porch in the evenings, wrapped in the cedar blanket, while Holt drank his coffee at the near end and pretended she wasn't changing the shape of his silence. She asked questions nobody else had ever thought to ask him. "What color is the sky today, Mr. Garrison. He looked up, startled by the question more than the voice. Gray. What kind of gray? Mama says there's 100 kinds of gray. And every one of 'em means something different. He studied the sky like a man reading a page he'd skipped over every day of his life. Pewter, I suppose, like the back of a spoon, but lighter toward the edges, where it touches the hills. What do the hills look like from here? Rolling, long and smooth, like the land's breathing in its sleep. Gold in summer. Right now, they're white on top where the snow sits and brown underneath where the wind's blown it clean. He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. Ain't nothing special. Sounds special to me. He didn't answer that, but the next time she asked about the creek ice and whether it had a color, he answered longer, the time after that, about what his mare looked like in the morning light, longer still. He described how frost caught the first sun and turned the fence wire into silver thread. How the pines on the eastern ridge stood in a line like soldiers who'd forgotten what they were guarding. How the creek ice was a color somewhere between blue and nothing at all. And how it sang a little when the afternoon sun hit it just right. He fumbled with the words at first. Then he didn't. Meanwhile, Josephine's kitchen had become the warmest room on the ranch. Not just the cook stove heat. The woman herself filled a space with steadiness the way good timber holds up a roof. You didn't notice it until you thought about what would happen if it wasn't there. Bess and Josephine ate supper together in the kitchen each evening. Their voices and laughter drifting through the house like wood smoke finding its way into every room. Holt still ate in his study, but he'd taken to leaving the door open a crack. One evening, without explanation or excuse, Holt knelt at the great stone hearth in the main room and built a fire. First one all winter. The kindling caught and the logs took hold and the room bloomed with a warmth that reached into corners that had been cold since autumn. Bess wandered in from the kitchen and sat on the rug near the hearth, holding her hands toward the flames. Holt told himself it was for her. The kitchen quarters didn't heat well. That was the reason. A practical matter. He had a dozen reasons for lighting that fire. Not one of them was the truth. Bess held her palms toward the warmth and said, "This house sounds different when it's warm. Mr. Garrison." She tilted her head, listening to the way the fire changed the silence. Like it just remembered something it forgot. Holt looked at the flames, looked at the girl, sat down in the chair across from her and stayed. The price of whispers. The trouble didn't come from the land or the weather or anything a man could fight with his hands. It came from town. It always did. Holt rode in for supplies on a Monday morning, the wagon rattling over frozen ruts. At Harlan's general store, he handed over his list and waited while the merchant gathered flour, salt, coffee, and canned goods. Harlan worked slow, which meant he had something to say. "Hear that widow's settling in real comfortable out at your place, Garrison." The merchant leaned across the counter, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who considers gossip a public service. "Whole town's talking about it. Young widow. Ain't she pretty enough, from what I hear?" He smiled. Too many teeth. "Reckon she knows a good situation when she sees one." Holt's hands went still on the counter. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. "She's my cook. Harlan, that's the whole of it. Sure, didn't mean nothing by it." But the smile stayed, and the damage was already done, spreading outward like a crack in river ice. At the post office, Eleanor Marsh was collecting her mail and collecting information in equal measure. She turned as Holt entered and gave him the kind of look that was half sympathy and half appetite. "Mr. Garrison, I do hope that woman and her poor blind child are being properly looked after. It must be such a burden. Taking in strangers. Folks are wondering if perhaps the church could help arrange something more appropriate." Holt took his mail without answering and walked out into the cold. By the time he loaded his wagon, his hands were tight on the reins and his jaw was set like granite. The old sickness had him. Not in his head, where he could argue with it, but in his chest, where it sat heavy and hot and familiar as a scar. Every kindness he'd ever shown had ended up in someone else's mouth, chewed into something unrecognizable. Even hiring a widow to cook meals had become currency for gossip, proof of something sordid, a transaction the whole town felt entitled to audit. He drove home in silence, the wagon rattling louder than it should have on the frozen road. That evening, he found Josephine in the kitchen and told her in even, measured words that it would be best if Bess stayed in the kitchen quarters and the yard during working hours. The barn and the main house were for ranch business. He said it without heat, without cruelty, but the warmth had gone out of his voice like a fire doused with creek water. Josephine held his eyes for a long moment. Whatever she felt, she kept it behind a face that had weathered harder things than a rich man's fear. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. Her dignity would not permit it. As you say, Mr. Garrison, she gathered Bess and withdrew. The kitchen door closed softly behind them. Not slammed. That would have been easier to bear. Bess asked her mother why Mr. Garrison's boots sounded different tonight. Is he angry, Mama? Josephine looked at her daughter, this girl who heard the world more clearly than anyone she'd ever known, and told her the truth. No, baby, he's scared, and scared men build fences. Holt sat alone in his study, door shut, hearth dark. The house returned to its old silence. Not the hold-in-its-breath kind, the flat kind, the heavy kind, the kind that doesn't wait for anything because it's forgotten there's anything to wait for. Holding its breath. Quiet. 3 days passed like stones dropped into deep water. No sound. No ripple. Just gone. Holt returned to the routines that had kept him upright for years. Barn at first light. Cattle by mid-morning. Ledgers in the afternoon. Supper alone in his study. Porch alone in the dark. Bed alone in the cold. The ranch ran smooth and precise, every hinge oiled, every fence mended, every animal tended. A man standing outside could look at it and say, there's a life in good order. But a well-ordered life, and a lived one, ain't always the same thing. Josephine cooked and cleaned and kept to the kitchen quarters with the quiet grace of a woman who understood that her dignity was the one thing no man's fear could take from her. She didn't seek Holt out. Didn't adjust her path to cross his. Whatever she carried private. The way she'd carried grief when her husband died and hardship when work was scarce, and the long patience of raising a blind daughter in a world that confused helplessness with inability. Bess. Though, Bess still sat on the kitchen porch every evening. She bundled herself in the cedar blanket and turned her face toward the far side of the house. And she listened the way she'd listened her whole life, with everything she had. She heard the creak of his rocking chair on the main porch, slow and aimless. She heard him cough, a wet, raw cough, the kind a man earns by sitting in February air without his coat because walking past the kitchen to fetch it meant feeling something he'd decided not to feel. She heard the long pauses between his footsteps out there, not the walk of a man going somewhere. The walk of a man who'd stopped but couldn't sit still. On the second evening, she heard him talking to Clara in the barn, later than usual, and his voice had lost the steadiness it usually carried with the horses. Even Clara knew. The mare stamped and blew and pressed her nose against his chest, and Holt stood there in the dark barn holding on to the only living thing he hadn't pushed away. On the third evening, Josephine sat beside Bess on the kitchen porch and spoke carefully, the way a woman speaks when she's made a decision that costs her. Bess, I think we ought to start thinking about what comes next. Mrs. Finley and Pendleton might still need help. We've stayed long enough. One more day, Mama. Baby, we can't keep. Please, just one more day. Josephine looked at her daughter's face in the failing light. Bess had her chin set the way she set it when she knew something the world hadn't caught up to yet. Josephine had learned years ago to trust that chin. One more day. That night, the house settled into its bones the way old houses do when the cold deepens. Bess lay still in her bed, listening, past the tick of the cooling stove, past the wind testing the window frame, past the silence. Then she heard them. Boots. Coming slow from the main house, down the long hallway, toward the kitchen door. They stopped on the other side of the pine boards, close enough that Bess could hear the man breathing. No knock, no voice, just Holt Garrison standing 2 inches from the door he couldn't open, wanting what was on the other side of it with everything he had and not knowing the first thing about how to reach for it. A full minute passed, maybe 2. Then the boots retreated, slow, heavy. The sound of a man walking away from the one thing he wanted because he'd spent so many years walking away that his feet didn't know another direction. Bess turned toward her mother's bed. Josephine was awake. Their eyes wouldn't have met even in the light, but something met between them all the same. "He stopped at our door. Mama," Bess whispered. "He just don't know how to knock." Josephine pressed her hand to her mouth. The tears came silent. She nodded in the dark. One more day. Kindness, trying to be quiet. The evening came in cold and clear. The kind of February night when the stars look close enough to touch, and the silence has a ring to it. Like a church bell struck once and left to hum across an empty valley. Holt sat on his porch. No coat, no coffee, no pretense. Just the chair and the cold and the particular stillness of a man who has run clean out of ways to tell himself he's fine. The kitchen door opened. He heard the footsteps, small, careful, sure of themselves in a way that had nothing to do with sight. Not Josephine's measured stride. Bess. She came around the corner of the house, one hand trailing the clapboard wall, counting boards by feel. She climbed the 2 steps to the main porch. She didn't hesitate at the top. She walked straight to the empty chair beside Holt, the one nobody had ever sat in, and settled into it the way a person sits down in a place they've already decided belongs to them. Holt didn't speak. Neither did she. The stars sharpened overhead. A coyote called from the eastern ridge and got no answer. The cold pressed in, patient and absolute, but neither of them moved. Then Bess spoke, not loud, just clear, the way a creek sounds when the ice finally cracks in spring. "Mr. Garrison, I've been listening since we got here. I know you might think that's just a girl with nothing better to do, but that ain't it." She paused, drew a breath. "I heard you talk to your horses in the mornings. You talk to them gentle, like they matter. I heard you stack firewood by the bunkhouse before your hands even wake up. And you never once said a word about it. I heard your boots slow down every single evening when my mama sings." The coyote called again, closer this time. Bess's voice softened but did not waver. "And the other night, I heard you come stand outside our door. You stood there a long time, Mr. Garrison, a real long time. Then you walked away." Holt's hands had gone still on the armrests of his chair. He stared straight ahead into the frozen dark. His breathing was shallow, like a man standing very still in the presence of something he doesn't want to frighten away. "Mr. Garrison, I can't see your face." She turned toward him, and her sightless eyes held a steadiness that most seeing eyes never achieve. "But I know your heart. It sounds like kindness trying to be quiet." The silence that followed was the longest of Holt Garrison's life. A wind moved through the pines on the ridge. A horse shifted in the barn. A star fell in the eastern sky, though neither of them saw it. The cold was there, the dark was there, and in the middle of it all, a 12-year-old girl had said the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. When he spoke, it came out rough and broken in the middle, like ice cracking on a February creek. Nobody ever heard that before. Bess reached over and laid her small hand on top of his. Her fingers were cold. His were colder, but something between them was warm, and it didn't need a fire or a roof or a name. It just needed to not be hidden anymore. They sat together while the stars turned their slow wheel overhead and the frozen hills kept their ancient silence. Inside the house, the hearth was dark. But out here, on this porch, between these two unlikely souls, something was burning that didn't require wood or stone to keep it alive. After a long while, Bess yawned, a real yawn. 12 years old, impossible to disguise. "You best get inside," Holt said. His voice was rough and quiet and new, like a road that hadn't been traveled in years. "Cold out here," Bess smiled. "You too, Mr. Garrison." She stood. He stood, and for the first time in days, Holt Garrison followed someone through the kitchen door. 3 places at supper. Valentinesday broke clear and cold over the Oregon hills. The sunrise spilling pink and amber across the snow like something painted by a hand steadier than any man's. Holt was up before first light, same as always. But instead of pulling on his boots and walking to the barn, he knelt at the great stone hearth and built a fire. Not a cautious fire, not a practical fire to chase the edge off a cold room. A real fire. 3 logs deep, kindling catching fast. Flames climbing high enough to throw light into every corner of a room that hadn't been used for anything but passing through in years. He stood and watched it take hold, felt the warmth push outward like a living thing, reaching into spaces that had been cold so long they'd forgotten what warm was. Then he walked to the dining room. The oak table was long and heavy, and wearing a thin film of dust he wiped clean with his shirt sleeve. He'd bought this table when he built the house. Back when he still imagined Sunday dinners and neighbors gathered and the kind of noise that means a house has become a home. It had seated one man and his silence ever since. Holt opened the sideboard drawer and took out cloth napkins. White, pressed sometime in another life, still folded neat. He set 3 places, 3 plates from the good set, 3 glasses. He pulled out 3 chairs and arranged the silverware and put the forks on the wrong side. Moved them, put them back, and decided it didn't matter which side the forks were on because the people sitting here would not be counting his silverware. When Josephine came to the kitchen at her usual hour, Bess at her side with one hand resting easy on her mother's elbow, they found Holt standing in the dining room doorway. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way a man does when he's about to say something he hasn't practiced and can't take back. "I set supper in here tonight," he said. "For 3, if you and Bess would care to sit with me." Josephine stopped in the doorway. She saw the table, the 3 settings, the napkins he'd pressed with his own hands that morning using a flat iron he'd had to hunt for in a closet, the fire blazing in the hearth behind him, throwing warm light across a room that had been dark for years. Her hand went to her heart, and she held it there, and her eyes filled with something bright that she was too strong and too proud to let fall. "We'd be honored, Mr. Garrison." The meal was simple: roast beef, cornbread, Josephine's preserves that she'd put up herself from the summer's last peaches. The conversation came slow and careful, the way it does between people learning a new language together. The language of belonging. Of sitting with someone not because you need something from them, but because the chair across from you has been empty long enough. Holt asked Bess about her favorite sounds. She thought about it serious, the way children do when they know the question matters. "Rain on a tin roof," she said, her mama laughing. "Horses breathing in a warm barn at night." She asked Holt what his favorite color was. He considered it longer than a man ought to consider a color, and said the gold that the hills turn in September, right before everything changes. Josephine told a story about a cattle drive where the chuck wagon threw a wheel crossing the Deschutes, and her husband fixed it with baling wire and what he called sincere prayer. Holt laughed. A short, rough sound, rusty with disuse, surprised out of him like a bird flushed from tall grass. He looked startled by his own laughter. And that made Bess laugh. And that made Josephine smile. And the sound of the three of them filled that dining room the way the fire filled the hearth. Holt looked at them. This widow who'd come for honest work and asked for nothing more. This girl who'd sat on his porch and told him the truest thing he'd ever heard. He understood now what he'd been protecting himself from all these years. And he understood it was the same thing he'd been afraid of losing. The silence that had lived in that house. Patient and heavy. The only guest Holt Garrison had kept for years. Finally turned to laughter. And the laughter filled every one of those 12 rooms the way morning fills a valley. Gentle and steady and a long time coming. Sometimes the ones who can't see you are the very ones who see you best. They listen for your heart when the world only looks at your hands. They hear the kindness you hide and the loneliness you won't name. And they sit beside you in the cold until you remember that warmth was never something you had to earn. In the dining room of the Garrison Ranch, the fire burned high and steady. 3 shadows moved on the wall where for years there had been only one. And outside, the February stars looked down on a house that was finally, after all this patient time, warm.